The President of the United States is threatening to start a trade war with Europe over a frozen island. Donald Trump has just announced sweeping 10% tariffs on 8 allied nations, a move he explicitly links to their opposition to his plan for the United States to purchase Greenland. This isn't a drill. It's a direct financial ultimatum to some of America's oldest friends: pay up in geopolitical concessions or pay up at the border. Is this a bold renegotiation of global relationships or a dangerous gambit that could shatter the Western alliance? Some call it strategic genius. Others call it economic blackmail. Who's right? Let's dive in. To understand this explosive moment, we need to rewind. The idea of the U.S. buying Greenland is not new to the Trump presidency. Trump publicly floated the notion back in 2019 during his first term, an offer Denmark's then Prime Minister swiftly called absurd. But now, in his second term, the concept has moved from a curious headline to a central pillar of Trump administration foreign policy, backed by the threat of economic force. The current crisis erupted on January 18, 2026. Following increased diplomatic pressure from the White House regarding Greenland, European leaders pushed back. In response, President Trump issued his tariff threat. The targets: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. The schedule: a 10% across-the-board tariff on all imports from these countries starting February 1st, escalating to a punishing 25% on June 1st. The stated condition: these tariffs will remain until, and I quote from the announcement, a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Simultaneously, we're seeing the rollout of another controversial Trump initiative, the so-called Board of Peace for Gaza. The administration has tapped figures like Senator Marco Rubio, former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, Jared Kushner, and World Bank President Ajay Banga as founding members. Crucially, Source 2 reveals a stunning financial requirement for this board: countries wanting a permanent seat must contribute at least $1 billion. Non-paying members would serve limited terms, renewable only by the chairman, President Trump himself. This creates a direct link between financial contribution and geopolitical influence in Trump's New World Order. Furthermore, adding another layer of tension with Europe, Source 3 reports the Trump administration is discussing offering asylum to British Jews, with Trump's personal lawyer declaring the UK no longer a safe place for Jews. This has infuriated the UK government. So we have a three-pronged confrontation: a territorial push for Greenland, a new pay-to-play peace board, and a profound challenge to a key ally's social stability. The central question is this: is this a coherent, if ruthless, strategy or a series of chaotic provocations? Supporters of President Trump's actions argue this is the hard-nosed, transactional statecraft he promised. They see a clear, strategic vision where American interests are paramount and allies must contribute their fair share. Proponents point first to national security. They argue Greenland is a geostrategic jewel. Its location offers unparalleled access to the Arctic, a region becoming increasingly contested with Russian and Chinese activity. Controlling Greenland, they say, would give the U.S. dominant control over future Arctic shipping routes and vast natural resources. For the Trump administration, owning it outright is the ultimate guarantee for U.S. security, far superior to basing rights. The tariffs, in this view, are not punishment but leverage, a tool to force a serious conversation Europe has been unwilling to have. Second, supporters defend the Board of Peace model. They argue traditional multilateral institutions like the UN have failed, mired in bureaucracy and bad deals for America. By requiring a $1 billion buy-in for a permanent seat, Trump is ensuring only seriously committed nations with skin in the game have a decisive voice. They point to the founding members, a mix of U.S. politicians, savvy businessmen like Apollo's Mark Rowan, and international figures, as evidence of a practical, results-oriented approach, not a diplomatic talking shop. The message: if you want a seat at the table, you must help pay for the meal. Regarding the asylum offer for British Jews, supporters frame it as a moral stance and a fulfillment of promise. They cite rising anti-Semitism in Europe and argue the U.S. is stepping up as a protector. It reinforces Trump's image as a decisive leader willing to make controversial calls for what he sees as right. Finally, on the tariffs themselves, the argument is about economic fairness and negotiation. Trump allies have long argued that Europe has taken advantage of the U.S. on trade. They see the 10%, rising to 25%, tariff as a corrective measure. Billions in potential tariff revenue, imagine 25% on German cars, French wine, and Danish pharmaceuticals, could be significant. The underlying philosophy is simple in Trump's world: all relationships, even with allies, are deals. And if a deal isn't good for America, you use leverage to get a better one. As one supporter might say, Why should American taxpayers shoulder the burden of defending Europe if Europe won't support core American interests like securing the Arctic? But wait, there's another side to this story. Critics, including the leaders of the targeted nations, see this not as strategy, but as a reckless act of economic and diplomatic vandalism. European reaction has been swift and furious. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called the threat completely wrong. French President Emmanuel Macron labeled it unacceptable. From their perspective, this is raw blackmail. Greenland is not a commodity. It is a self-governing territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. Its people, as shown by the hands-off Greenland protests in Copenhagen and Nuuk attended by thousands, have made their opposition clear. The Trump administration's threat to not rule out taking it by force, mentioned in Source 4, is seen as a shocking violation of the sovereignty and democratic will of allied nations. Opponents counter that the tariff weapon is wildly disproportionate and self-damaging. A 25% tariff on European goods would be a massive tax on American consumers and businesses. That cost would be passed on. Think about the German auto worker or the French farmer, their livelihoods threatened. But also think about the American manufacturer who needs specialized Danish machinery or the US supermarket chain that sells Italian cheese and French wine. Their costs would skyrocket. This could trigger inflation and hurt the very US economy Trump vows to protect. The Board of Peace fee is lambasted as corruption institutionalized. Critics argue it creates a direct pay-for-play system in global diplomacy, where geopolitical influence is auctioned to the highest bidder, not earned through democratic legitimacy or constructive policy. It sidelines poorer but affected nations and makes conflict resolution a transactional game for billionaires and wealthy states. How can a board requiring a $1 billion entry fee possibly claim moral authority in Gaza, where the World Bank notes a quarter of developing countries are poorer than before COVID-19? The asylum offer for UK Jews is viewed by the opposition as a deeply cynical and inflammatory move. The British government sees it as an outrageous interference in its domestic affairs and a gross mischaracterization of societal safety. It appears designed to create division and leverage against a key ally. The broader critique is that this approach doesn't make America stronger, it isolates it. It treats NATO allies and trade partners like adversaries. It undermines 80 years of post-war alliance building based on shared values, not mere transactions. The danger, critics warn, is a fragmented West at a time of rising challenges from authoritarian states. As one European diplomat might privately say, he is using the tactics of coercion against his friends. Who will trust us when we need to stand together against real foes? So who's right? Let's look at the evidence and the numbers. The data paints a picture of high stakes and significant collateral damage. First, the trade numbers. The European Union as a bloc is the United States' largest trading partner in goods and services. In 2023, two-way trade totaled over $1.3 trillion. The 8 targeted nations constitute a massive portion of that. The proposed tariffs are not on trivial goods. We're talking about automotive sectors, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods. The initial 10% tariff would act as an immediate multi-billion-dollar tax on this exchange. The escalation to 25% would be among the highest peacetime tariffs between modern allies, potentially choking trade flows. Historical evidence from the 2018-2020 trade wars shows such tariffs did not improve the U.S. trade deficit as intended, but did raise costs for consumers and hurt agricultural exporters who faced retaliatory measures. Second, the Greenland context. Greenland's strategic value is real, but its economic reality is nuanced. Its annual budget subsidy from Denmark is roughly $708 million. Its economy, while potentially resource-rich, is currently small. The cost to the U.S. to not only purchase the territory, a legally dubious concept, but also to assume responsibility for its infrastructure, social services, and population of 56,000 would be enormous, likely requiring annual subsidies in the hundreds of millions, if not billions, for decades. The $400 million in annual U.S. aid to Greenland and Denmark for defense and development, a figure often cited, would pale in comparison to the full cost of ownership. Third, the Board of Peace finances. The $1 billion seat fee is unprecedented. Compare it to the U.S. assessed contribution to the UN regular budget for 2023, which was about $700 million. This single seat fee is larger. It creates a governance model where a country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE could buy permanent influence, while a traditionally important but less cash-rich player in the region could be sidelined. It financializes diplomacy to an extreme degree. Finally, the human impact. Beyond the macro numbers, consider the micro. A Danish cheese exporter facing a 25% tariff might see his $265,000 annual U.S. sales evaporate. A UK-based tech SME relying on $100 million in U.S. contracts could see its margins destroyed. An American car dealership might have to add $20,000 to the sticker price of a European import. These aren't abstract statistics. They are livelihoods, businesses, and family budgets on both sides of the Atlantic. The reality is more complex than either side fully admits. What most people miss is that this isn't really about Greenland's minerals or Gaza's governance. It's about a fundamental and deliberate rupture in how international relations are conducted. President Trump's actions are coherent within his long-stated worldview that the post-WWII liberal international order is a bad deal for America. The tariffs, the billion-dollar board fees, the territorial claim, they are all tools to dismantle that order and replace it with a network of bilateral, transactional relationships where the U.S., as the strongest power, can dictate terms. In that sense, it is a strategy. It's not chaotic, it's revolutionary. However, the evidence strongly suggests the costs of this revolution will be staggeringly high. The economic data predicts severe disruption to deeply integrated supply chains and consumer markets. The diplomatic evidence shows it is alienating the very nations whose cooperation is vital for confronting shared threats like a resurgent Russia or an assertive China. The gamble is that the shock of these actions will force allies to capitulate and accept this new America First framework. The great risk is that instead, it pushes them away, fostering a more fragmented, volatile, and less predictable world where might makes right becomes the dominant rule. The uncomfortable truth is that we are witnessing a high-stakes test of whether alliances built on shared values can survive a pressure campaign built solely on transactional value. For ordinary people, the impact will be felt in prices and uncertainty. Europeans working in export industries face immediate job insecurity. Americans shopping for imported goods from cars to cheese to machinery will see costs rise, potentially fueling inflation. Investors and businesses operating across the Atlantic are plunged into paralyzing uncertainty, which stifles investment and growth. What to watch next is critical. First, the EU's emergency meeting and its response. Will it file a WTO case? Will it prepare retaliatory tariffs? Second, the domestic reaction in the U.S. Will Congress push back? Third, the February 1st deadline. Will the 10% tariff be implemented as a starting gun, or will last-minute talks pull us back from the brink? And finally, watch the other targeted nations like the UK, now dealing with both a tariff threat and an asylum controversy. Will this fracture the special relationship permanently? The coming weeks will determine if this is a negotiating tactic or the new, permanent state of transatlantic affairs. So, we're left with a stark divide, a vision of strong, unilateral America leveraging its power versus a warning of shattered alliances and global instability. This is the defining foreign policy clash of the early Trump second term. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Drop a 1 if you believe Trump's tariff strategy is a tough but necessary rebalancing. Drop a 2 if you see it as a dangerous mistake that hurts everyone. Let's debate in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see both sides of the story. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for more breaking news.